We are recording. So someone say something interesting.
So I think Bentley, we agreed last meeting to skip definitions for some time and start discussing modeling, some of the things we have agreed on definition-wise so far.
Yeah.
So what I did, I added a domain model implementations thing to the glossary board to the left of the resources, where I currently implemented the declarative sentences and claim definition in Kotlin. That's personally because it was so tiny, I just thought it's easier to implement it and start drawing UML diagrams, etc. So Timothy was kind enough to set up a repository. And I think the current idea is that everyone can just add their own sub projects basically within that main repository to do their own implementations if they want to. Or you can just add your diagrams maybe there.
Yeah.
And then the suggestion, of course, would be to co-evolve those as we align on definitions, do some modeling. If then the models give rise to discussions like, hey, I would do this differently, why? In order to be able to talk about that, we can start discussing definitions again.
And what, I'm sorry, you said, and I could probably look it up, but what kind of language or format specification are we using?
This is simply written in Kotlin. It's a domain model, so it's language, well, it's format agnostic, but right now I set up a serializer that can serialize it to JSON.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I think that's the one that I found that I thought would be awesome because it serializes to all these different formats. Yeah, so that's great.
Yeah, Kotlin Next serialization is pretty cool. I started using it for work because, well, we're doing a multi-platform project. So it compiles down to different languages, Kotlin multi-platform. So it compiles down to a JavaScript library, it compiles down to a Java library, it even has support for native. I haven't played around with that yet. And then specifically the serialization library is also multi-platform. So out of the box, you have a serializer you can use for the front end, for example, in a JavaScript library, but also for the backend. And you can even change the data format if you want, but so far I've always used JSON serialization.
Okay, great.
The link Kotlin multi-platform leads elsewhere in the CD domain model instead of to an external tool. Is that right?
What do you mean by external tool? It's simply the sub-project that I created.
Okay. But there's two things that, so there's a specification for that modelization language somewhere?
Do you mean a specification for the JSON?
No, for the you're saying this Kotlin multi-platform language, and is there I'm sure there's a specification for that language somewhere.
It wants a link to the documentation of Kotlin.
Well, you can just Google Kotlin multi-platform, then you'll find it.
Okay, fine.
I don't know, that doesn't come up for me. Kotlin language, Kotlin multi-platform. I mean, I get lots of links and it'd be nice to have it.
I get the Kotlin language. Let's see. But is there?
I'm not certain I understand what the question is. Kotlin is simply
just give us a canonical place to learn about Kotlin.
Okay, Kotlin language.
No. Well, Kotlin is a language, but there's a subset of the language that's about this domain modeling, and that's the part. Oh.
So domain modeling is domain-driven design, whatever you want to call it. Domain modeling is simply.
Okay, so you want us to use Kotlin, the language?
Well, you don't have to. I simply did the current modeling in Kotlin.
The idea of this repository was just a place to essentially define domain models in whatever language people want and have it tracked, and you can do PRs and things like that. But people can propose alternative domain models. It's not the definitive domain model, and you can do it in whatever language you want. I don't know if it should have been, I mean, it is Kotlin, so I don't know if that's the name that should be in the parent folder, because there's another aspect is it's like Steven's version of the domain model, right?
That's what I expected to see first. The fact that Steven's using Kotlin and I'm using, for example, PUML right now, and something else eventually I think is more important than.
Yeah, Mark
Right,
Antoine,
it's a combination of the two. Like if you want to do Stephen's model in a separate language, then
Yes,
maybe they'd be both under Stephen's model and then two parallel folders.
Well,
or something.
I think the question is also what is in there so far. So my suggestion would be not to implement anything more than that we aligned on as part of these meetings. So I wouldn't want us to go off on I mean, I have my own model that I use in production on a different repository, obviously. This is simply my implementation of what we have agreed on so far consensus-wise in order to enable the discussion. So I wouldn't go off on a tangent and add features that we haven't talked about as part of these meetings. And I think the same should go for all the suggested models. So if we, as part of these meetings, align on a specific JSON format, then these would simply be different projects that know how to parse a JSON format. That's my suggestion.
Yeah. Well, trying to read I don't know Kotlin, so.
Yeah, you need to, because it's multi-platform, you need to, let me link you to the exact source files because there's only really two.
I'm seeing the exact source file and
right.
It's
so the only thing right now that's implemented, if you open, for example, the claim claim file, the only thing that's there that you wouldn't expect, maybe the fact that the string, the ID of the claim is a string. That's something we haven't necessarily talked about, or at least haven't explicitly said we agree on yet. And then it's simply the glossary documentation. It's a set of sentences, and that's it. And then I added a constraint that the sentences cannot be empty, because can you even create a claim if there's no sentence linked to it? Our glossary definition currently says, or implies that's not possible. And that's, I think, one of the only things. Then that it uses a snapshotting pattern, which is simply to maintain immutability. It's a DTO object, a snapshot, if you will. Right now, it's nothing. It's a simple redirect. But as this class grows, this will become more complex.
Oh, when you say mutable, do you mean that adding a declarative sentence link would create a new object?
No. So claim itself is mutable. But at any given point in time, if you want to serialize it, you need to get a snapshot in time, the current version of the claim, which you do through the get snapshot function, and that returns a mutable object that's serializable.
Fair. Yeah, I'm not sure. Will a claim always have a sentence? Probably true. It's not true of topics in general. It may be true of claims.
So yeah, that's one thing we can discuss. And again, I don't recommend to look at the source code right now. I think it makes more sense to look at the JSON output, for example, because again, the suggestion would be that we align on the format, and then we just simply have different projects that can parse it.
Oh dear, it's okay. Well, okay. Let's look at the JSON. That's a good idea because my JSON was going to be so different because of all the constraints that I introduced later in the vocabulary, which is why I don't serialize things the way you do, but I see things as interdependent. But we'll get there.
Did you link to the JSON and those links in the?
So there are unit tests. I haven't output them anywhere yet. It would make sense to add some type of README. I guess for now, what I could do is screen share and simply run the projects.
Let's.
But it's very straightforward right now. It's what you would expect. I think it's yeah. Let me try to open the projects. Need to switch desktops. I've been doing Kotlin now for 4 years almost, I think. I really like it, to be honest. I've been doing C# mostly before that. Also Socrates is C#.
I've heard great things about Kotlin.
We have
But
so much code reuse, it's insane.
have you read the article on code reuse in Julia? Really fascinating.
I'm not certain I have. I don't think so.
I'm not saying we should use Julia. It's too far. It's not as web friendly, but they say they achieve one of the highest level of intermodule composability of any language thanks to multiple dispatch. And I'm still curious how they achieve that. I'm not sure I understand how multiple dispatch helps, but I've always highly believed in multiple dispatch as a great way to combine things. Single dispatch is such a weird constraint.
So a simple example here, you have a simple declarative sentence. You can see my screen, I presume?
Yes.
Okay. You have a simple sentence, Socrates is a man. Normally you can just create a claim. Because it's a unit test that tests the snapshots, I create a snapshot directly. It has an ID. I just give it 0 here, for example, and a set of sentences. The sentence right now serializes as a primitive, meaning just a string. You'll see in a second what that means. And then you get a very basic JSON object with nothing more than an ID and a set of strings, basically. It's compiling. There we go. Can I show this? Boop, boop, boop.
So that means that format means that there's no sentence reuse.
Why not? The sentence right now is the ID. So if you use this very sentence elsewhere, it will be the same identity of that sentence then this, so.
Yes. Well, okay. I see what you're saying, but I call that no sentence reuse. But yeah, the sentence is the ID, I guess. If it's a very long sentence, it means very long IDs. Don't index well.
It's a data object in Kotlin automatically has a hash generated from it for equality checking. So I can go to, so this is a data class, but this is, I mean, these are implementation details. What this means is that automatically the equals function and a hash code function is generated from the containing data. In this case, all this is a string. So there will be a hash code tied to this thing that it uses under the covers for equality. But I don't think that matters for the domain model. It's really an implementation detail. So I think this is all we have right now based on the glossary. So this gives rise to, does a claim need a sentence? I assumed yes, otherwise, what is it? So I added that constraint. We can discuss whether or not everyone agrees with that. And then the JSON format itself, I guess. Yeah. Oh, and whether or not the IDs should be a string or something different.
Well, can you go back to the test? Because I still can't read that.
Yeah, it's better to go to the claim tests. So the constraints of the claim are modeled in the domain model. This is a snapshot. So from the domain model, you can get a snapshot like here. So you have a claim. For example, you can create a claim from a declarative sentence. You give it an ID, you give it a sentence, and then you can get the snapshot in order to serialize it.
Yeah. So, and I was hearing that it then the sentence. I mean, it does come down like Marc-Antoine was saying that it doesn't give me the idea of reuse. But I mean, actually, that's not part of our requirements at the second. Like it's not in the definition, but I think it's something we've all kind of
But if
wanted.
we introduce it, all that code will have to be rewritten.
Which is
Define reuse.
which is
Define
fine.
reuse. I think what you're referring to is if you have some repository of declarative sentences that it points to the same entity or something along those lines, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So no, right now it doesn't, but again, that's an implementation detail. Right
Well,
now,
it's also a specification to say that a sentence, it can be modified and not lose all of its connections. If it's a
Yes.
hash,
Well,
then
is there supposed to be a one-to-one relationship or a one-to-many relationship from a sentence to claims?
I was expecting a one-to-many from sentence to claims, yes.
I think that's what he has, right?
yeah, of course, except that the identity of the sentence is the sentence itself. So
Well,
rather than here in
which doesn't
sentences
help.
pointing to IDs, so an alternative format could be that you have a set of, let's say, sentences, and then this points to the ID of the set of sentences. But I would argue I see no point for having an identity for sentences because the sentence itself is the identity.
But if there's a typo in the sentence and you have to correct it, then suddenly it loses all its links to everything.
Or it means that you need to correct the sentence everywhere where it's used.
Yeah, which I admit is what I would have immutable sentences and would correct the links personally or obsolete the links. That would be my approach.
I'm not quite understanding this discussion because to me it's like saying there's a one-to-many relationship between the number 4 and all objects because we use the number 4 all over the place. And I'm like, so it's a primitive to me. I don't understand why sentence needs to have its own existence.
I agree.
Because
for me, it's also primitive.
Because it's okay. Two reasons. Call me old-fashioned, but putting large object as indexes is inefficient in databases. That's one thing. We can use SHA-256, which is big, but
that's not domain model level.
That's implementation model. Fair enough. But in terms of domain model, I think that it is going to be a frequent request for me to say, I have a sentence. What are all the possible claims I can find for this sentence?
But you can search. I mean, that's a full
without doing a linear search. Okay, in this interface, there's no way to do this. And I agree, this is indexing is not domain modeling, but being able to have, here's a collection of topics, and I want to be able to give me all topics that have this sentence. And that is something I'd expect to find at the domain model, the ability to go from sentence to set of topics.
Okay, I think we might need to define then what we understand by domain model, because what you're describing, I would call an application service or a use case. So a domain model contains the constraints of the objects you're dealing with. Around that, you have application services which interact with the domain model. So you might indeed exactly have a use case search for all claims with a particular sentence, which then might return domain model objects, or even like DTOs for them. But that's a separate discussion as far as I see it.
But okay, in my notion of domain modeling, for example, the distinction between one-to-many and many-to-many is part of the domain model. And right now, there's no way for me to know if in this domain whether the relationship is one-to-many or many-to-many. And I say it's many-to-many and traversable.
It supports both right now. It supports both right now.
No, it doesn't.
I think we're talking about...
Well, it doesn't make the distinction.
I think we're talking about potentially modeling a repository of some sort, but then the question is repository of what? And given that this is supposed to be like a interchange format, it would be the repository of all the claims represented within whatever payload you want to send somewhere.
For me, it's partly because I'm doing a repository of changes. See, I'm going event-driven, so I'm much more atomic. For each of these, association of a claim to a sentence is itself something that can be discussed. It's a topic, and hence it has an identity. Each of those links has an identity for me, which is absent in your model.
Okay, so that gives rise to maybe things we need to discuss in the glossary or not. I think we need to agree whether or not we want to discuss that. and what to name it if that's what you want to. So what would you call that link, for example? I would suggest that you add a thing to discuss on the backlog for the glossary.
In any, sorry, I'll be describing it using relational terms, even if I'm not saying we should do this relationally necessarily. But when we have a many-to-many relationship in a database, a relational database, we do the claim sentence joint table. So this is what I would call the claim sentence link, or the claim sentence association. And it's an object, it has an identity, so we can discuss it and contest it and say, I'm not sure that this sentence represents that claim. And this, the fact that this sentence represents that claim has been proposed by so-and-so and has a history and has a biography and provenance and so on. So yeah, I'd call that a claim sentence link. Okay, Tim disagrees. What?
Do not want that. No, I don't want that kind of overhead in the system.
Yeah, to me it also sounds a bit out of scope. And yeah.
Why?
Well, first of all, you're talking very much from a concrete implementation right now. So first of all, if you want to argue for this, I would like to hear the concrete use case.
The concrete use case is knowing who claimed that this sentence accurately, that this claim accurately represents that sentence, or vice versa, and being able to track the quality of the links made by contributors.
So we're talking more about provenance of maybe the construction of this data model than this specific data model. Because again, that's something that can live outside of the domain model, right? You can perfectly track, oh, that person added that sentence to that claim, and you can fully do whatever you want outside of this shared domain model.
But that means you're making, okay. For me, it's essential to do, and I would argue it's essential to do in the shared domain model, and that's a valid point of contention. Is there a restricted domain model that is not the domain model of what I see as the applications we're building? But for me, the application we're building, it's in scope. For the application we're building, knowing who made that association is in scope, because we'll want to track the validity of these associations.
And at the same time, we also discussed that we don't want to link the authors to claims. I'm not certain we were talking about the same domain model here. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's the notion of, for anti-spam purposes, being able to hold people responsible for their actions in the system. So
kind of, yeah.
That, that sort of link does need to be tracked for that purpose, for the purpose of like viewing and interacting with a debate. It's my understanding and desire that it's out of scope, but for, spam, anti-spam measures, it's probably necessary.
Well, and for training measures, right? I mean, I see how Society Library needs it.
Society Library is outside of the scope of the CDL.
Well, that's exactly what we're discussing. It's true, you introduce a distinction between interchange scope and application scope, and which I do not believe in. And that's definitely something to discuss, in the sense that I'm interested in an ecosystem of a very supple ecosystem of applications, so that we can share everything. And that means we can share the representation of anything we do, including provenance. Now it's true that, can we imagine this? And and you know what, the reason I'm doing that is that I can perfectly see one application in the ecosystem to do filtering based on provenance. It's perfectly in scope for the interchange format to have provenance.
How so?
Because it's not because CDL doesn't want to distinguish on provenance that other applications talking about claims don't want to use provenance as a basis to discriminate claims. I'm saying it
But,
still has to
you know,
be
it's a-
representable.
Oh, but I mean, you could come up with a million features that some system might want to support. The canonical debate should not have to support every possible imaginable feature, right? It has to support what it is within its scope, right?
No, that's correct. But I thought we were defining the domain of the interchange format, not the domain of one application and using the interchange format. And the interchange format has to handle anything any application in the ecosystem wants to handle.
No, it has to handle what all applications want to share. Like it has to handle what all of us can agree on that we all need. It doesn't need to handle what every one of all of us want. That's impossible. So it only intends to support what we can all agree on as a group.
And I'm saying
we intend to grow that organically, right?
And I'm saying I definitely want to share provenance. And
we can model provenance. And for example, I think one thing which would be useful is not to just have a declarative sentence, but indeed know optionally who is declaring it. And that's, I think, part of your provenance, right? And I think that's what Jamie also needs, by the way. Like, oh, this comes from that article, etc.
That's different. That's the link. That's the link between sentence and document, which is totally independent from the link between sentence and claim.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And both need provenance.
Oh, you also want, okay, I know, got it.
Yeah, but if the canonical debate is not going to support provenance,
that's fair.
Then you're just going to get holes in the data.
That's correct.
In that case, why does the interchange format need to support this as opposed to like metadata or something?
Because some applications will provide it. It's not because canonical debate
like
doesn't provide it.
Society library can provide like links,
and that means it has to be part of the modeling domain. If it's something that society library can provide, then it has to be part of the modeling of the data model.
No, I totally disagree because you're future proofing infinitely. There's so many different ways that this can be sliced and diced on a layer 2, and that's not going to be supported because there's no way to support it all. You'll never be able to think of all the possibilities.
Well, that's why I'm using topics as an underlying model, because it's generic enough that you can model anything. That's the point.
But metadata can model anything too.
And I'm proposing a metadata format. I'm proposing
okay, that's fine as a metadata format, but what I'm saying is a metadata format should allow extensions. It should have an extension format, and then if you want to share data and publish your own extension format, go for it. But that's not part of the fundamental interchange format.
What I'm saying is the metadata has something to hook to. That means that the links have to have identifiers, because otherwise the metadata cannot have anything to hook to.
So that's why the main discussions in domain model should always be what is the identity. In the case of the two entities we identified right now, I suggest the identifier of a declarative sentence is simply the sentence itself. Timothy seems to agree. You seem to disagree, Marc-Antoine. And of a claim, I added a string ID, which can be whatever.
Yeah, I would tend to go for URI there, but that's not important. And I'm not going to hold on to that. But I'm saying there's a third entity, which is the link between them, because it's a many-to-many, and the link between them is an entity in its own right and needs an identity.
Well, it could be a combined ID, obviously, of the two identities, and then you have the link, and you can perfectly point to that from an external system, right?
And then we're back to the question of, do we allow arbitrary length identities because it plays havoc with indexing? The claim, the claim itself, how do we do the claim? I mean, at some point we'll compose claims, and when we do composite claims, is the identity of the composite the concatenation of the identities? We'll get entities like this, and then adding the sentence, which can be of arbitrary length. I've seen page-long sentences. Thank you very much. is that an identity?
So no, the identity right now of claim is the ID that's given, then that's fully application specific. That's my current suggestion with just having it a string.
But the identity between the relationship, the identity of the relationship between the claim and the sentence is what Marc-Antoine is talking about.
Yes,
If
but
you still want to use the string of the statement as the identifier. Now, you said earlier, I think, that your implementation will use the hash, so it doesn't have the problem Marc-Antoine suggesting about the.
But even if you don't have the hash, if we agree the identity of a declarative sentence is the sentence itself, then the identity of the relation is nothing more than two identities, meaning the identity of the claim and the sentence itself.
And how do you store the identity of the sentence of itself?
You store the sentence.
Okay.
But then you're passing around the sentence.
Exactly.
If you want to attach a metadata, then you have to pass, then the identity for that piece of metadata is the complete sentence, which could be thousands of characters long.
Can it?
Yes.
I think
Right now we haven't set a limit.
Yeah.
I think the discussion we're having is whether or not we should have an identity for declarative sentence or whether or not it's a primitive. That's a discussion. Do you want it to be immutable, or do you want to?
And I would go for immutable. And this is why I'm saying, actually, in a way, Stephen, I agree with you, because IPLD solves all that. IPLD says, let's equate the sentence with its hash, with its SHA-256 hash, which is almost
then it's immutable.
And then it's immutable. And then use the IPLD construction rules to use the hash of the link, which then gets identity because it's also immutable, and that's fine. And then we can tag on metadata to everything. That solves a lot of problems of this conversation. But it means adopting the model that we use hash as identity and making it part of the interchange format, which I would favor.
The domain model doesn't care.
It
really does. It's whether what identity is really an implementation. I mean,
no. The question is the link addressable? The way you've designed the domain model now, it isn't. And for me, the domain model being addressable is a concern.
But I don't see why it isn't. It's addressable by the full sentence. And yes, that may be
okay.
too heavy, so you might want to use a hash to optimize for that. But I mean, it is addressable.
No.
So if we are going to pass data between two systems, and then we have agreed upon later some metadata, what's going to be passed, the hash or the string?
Well, that depends whether you want to point to sentences.
I would put the hash myself. So, okay, you've come up with a JSON, I've come up with a JSON, so let's go there.
When do you want to point to specific declarative sentences? What are the use cases?
No, well, the link between the sentence. Well, yeah, that's a good question. What's the
I want to point.
So we want to say that X. I don't know if we're keeping this in scope, but X person at this date attach this sentence to this claim. And so the domain model for that entity, of that time-stamped entity, would have to either have the hash or the sentence, which is fine. If we all agree on the hash, but then I would want to make that explicit in this model itself.
Here's a question for the interchange format. Is it at any level meant to be human readable? Is it, I mean, at that point, we might as well define it just being binary. If not, if we're looking for efficiency, if we're looking for it being human readable, this would be a step away from that, because no claim will be readable. You'll need to.
I don't think it needs to be human readable, but it doesn't mean you have to go to binary.
Yeah, I think there's intermediate results in terms of human readable versus not. I think what I'm proposing is semi-readable, and I'd like to show it. But yeah, the having these pairs be addressable is a hard requirement for the metadata to be possible.
But it is addressable. If we agree it's immutable, the sentence itself is identity, you can use a hash code in your implementation to address it.
And then you can make the pair into something.
Exactly.
And I'm saying in IPLD, you make all of this into hashes, which reduces volume tremendously at the expense of readability. I absolutely agree with that point, but it can be
No, but
done.
in your metadata, you can store the hashes. What I'm saying is there's no need to store the hashes right next to the sentence, right? It's the same data.
That is correct.
Assuming you have agreed upon hash model, but yeah.
Yes.
Sorry?
Assuming you have an agreed upon hash
Yes,
algorithm.
exactly. Exactly.
Which, you know, you can
Exactly, but that's why it's an implementation detail. So I
No,
think we need to pick up this discussion if we want to model in our domain model, in our glossary, references to declarative sentences. And that's why my question was, do we know these use cases right now that we share as a group?
And I do say, I gave them, I'll give them again, being able to say, here's a sentence, give me all the claims, give me all the documents where it was found. That is entirely, those are real use cases.
That's still possible, right?
And one second, I'm not done. In the case of being able to attach the provenance metadata to something, to an anchor. And by the way, we speak of readability. If we put sentences without the hash in the claim, and I'm not against that as such, but I would say, then let's have the hash somewhere in the document, because otherwise I'll attach something to the hash elsewhere and it won't be clear at all that it's attached to the sentence because that link will be absent. Speaking of unreadable.
So yeah, one reason, I hear you. One reason for adding the hash as part of, like, let's make an object, let's not make it a string primitive, let's add it, is so that you don't need to know the hash implementation in order to point to it, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
But then we can just as well pick any other arbitrary ID, but
I agree with that. I agree with that. For me, the JSON LD trick is a way to standardize a lot of hashes and normalize them. And I think it's extremely useful and important, but I would not expect everybody to use it in the ecosystem because that's a hard constraint. Because there's a lot of legacy data that exists that doesn't use it. So yes, we have to accept arbitrary IDs for the pair. And that means the pair identity has to be explicit in the model.
Yeah, I don't know yet. I mean, I wouldn't be against adding it if within the domain model we intend to share within the CD, we need to point to it. But
so yeah, for the use case, Marc Antoine, you kind of said attached to something. So is the explicit use case the
Provenance?
Provenance?
It is one use case.
So
yes.
yeah. Okay. So we're saying that we also want to, as a core feature of the system, be able to pass the history of the changes to.
Yeah, there's provenance, and there's another one for you, is basically contesting. I do not believe that this claim is a valid representation of this sentence, or vice versa. I do not believe that this sentence expresses this claim. I want to be able to contest that pair as a user, as part of the ecosystem. For me, that's a use case. And it's not a delete because somebody else may disagree with me on that. It's somebody says this link exists, somebody says this link exists, somebody says this link doesn't exist, and we have to be able to be aware of both to take a decision. Until it's contested, it's not problematic. If it's contested, well, it is problematic, and we have to arrive at a decision, and that means we have to be able to talk about this thing. It's a topic. It has an identity.
Do we want to go ahead and look at Marc Antoine's model? Did you say you had one, Marc Antoine?
Yeah.
As well.
Sorry, I know I'm browbeating a lot, and it is true that there is a valid concern about which scope are we talking about here? Or is it, but I'll go one more, I'll say one last thing. I mean, yes, it's an interchange format, but do we want to have an interchange format that's distinct from what we'll use in our APIs between back and front end? Because that's a huge burden as well, to have two interchange formats. And that way, I think that provenance is something we'll need in our front end, because again, we'll be watching who did what. And that means it has to be part of the data model.
Well, okay, but an alternative modeling of this for that purpose of provenance and who did what is recording events generically. And then you know who did what event, and one of those events is proposing a sentence, right?
Yeah,
and in that case, we don't need
the interchange
link.
format is the events.
No, we don't need a link between the claim and the sentence in order to record that that sentence was proposed. You have a link between a person or a user and an event, and it happens to be that type of event or that version. So you see the delta. And so you don't have an explicit link. You have a link in the event model.
No, that is absolutely valid. Let's
yes,
have
and that means we're starting to talk about modifications and modeling modifications, whereas what we're modeling now is the result of having modeled it. So and yeah, we can totally also share that model, but it's a different model. It's indeed more of a delta model.
Yep, absolutely, which is what I've been proposing all along, yes.
But these are different objects, and these, that's the point here.
Yeah,
these will be separate objects. These will be events, as Timothy suggests.
Totally true. And I do believe that we're better off just sharing events and not sharing the state. I think state is a...
I don't think either of them were suggesting that, Mark.
I know, but
okay.
It is what I'm...
You said you agree, and I was maybe with yourself. I don't know.
I mean, in an ideal world, you can implement it using event sourcing, and then you only consume the events. But you also want just to represent. I mean, what I want, for example, is simply you pull in all the data of a set of claims, you have a full graph, and you want to render that in a web browser. I want a shared format for that.
But what I'm saying is, at some point, I'll have, here's the state, and what is the provenance of that thing in the state? What events did it come from? So I can track back to the person, because that's also a use case. And in which case, I need, again, to have an identity for the object, so I can ask the question about which event held that object. Which event made that happen? Well, I need to be able to name that. And again, I need an identity for that.
I think the stronger use case that rather than provenance is we want to debate whether that sentence belongs to the claim.
Those are two use cases.
Yeah, and I just think that's
true.
That I think just Stephen and Timothy keep going back to the provenance one, which can be handled in an event sourcing one. But the debate with a log system. But the debate about, I want to debate that this sentence doesn't belong to that claim, can't be handled in an event system, I don't think, in a log. So that's why it needs to be represented in the model.
Well, that depends how you want to
model. Except that you don't, do you want to debate it because of who proposed it? Or do you want to debate?
No, I don't care who, take who off.
Yeah.
Someone is saying that this sentence that is currently linked should not be.
So I think if that's what you want to model, then we need to model that type of claim, and then we're starting to talk about more specific types of claims.
Mm-hmm. What?
Yeah, this is a claim that's more than just a declarative sentence. Right now, we said a claim has a set of declarative sentences. You're saying right now, this is a claim that points to this claim.
And now I recognize the age-old problem of reification. That is, if you make the reification separate from the base object, what is the link between the reification and the base object? Like, I understand the temptation to do that, to say the claim of is this claim and the sentence link. That's a separate claim, which is, I do believe that, by the way, it is a separate claim. But is it distinct from the basic link, the one that you modeled, and then what's the relation between that basic link and the claim version link becomes complex. What I'm saying is, let's just have something that is the basic link, but it is also a topic so that it can be treated as a claim at need.
And you want that, I think the key point you're highlighting is you want those identities to live in the same space, the same addressable space.
Yes.
Right?
Right. And this is why I'm using topic modeling, where everything, and including every link, has an identity, because
so
it
I'm
can be
not certain
contentious.
what's the benefit of having the same addressable space if you. So you share the same identifier space, but in order to deal with that identifier, you still need to understand what it represents, right?
Yes.
So it's not like by simply addressing a global ID space that you solve the problem. You simply share the same ID space. That's all. The abstraction doesn't go further than that. It's not like now you know how to render this or whatever.
No, okay, I see what you're saying. It's more, okay, that way it is more than just sharing the identity, though there is a subtle discussion there that's interesting. But what I'm saying is, you're saying let's make this a claim at need. And I'm saying, let's make it always a claim, and let's use that structure as the link. Or let's...
it's a specific type of claim that still has a declarative sentence, but it also points to your two identifiers, another claim, and maybe the declarative sentence.
In the sense that every claim, every association is a claim, right? And it's actually many claims because of each role.
So you mentioned association. So association is not in the glossary, but I think what you're arguing is it should be. So I suggest that you do that.
Well, and then I'm told, oh, but this is implementation talk. Well, yes, it is. I'm saying, because we're dealing with language, we need full reflexivity. Because we need full reflexivity, everything has an identity, and hence I propose using domain topic maps as the underlying implementation. And yes, it's an implementation concern, but it's germane to the domain model. The separation between domain and implementation in this case falls flat.
Yeah, so I don't see the benefit of making the core data model so abstract that it supports anything. Because again, it doesn't handle the complexity. It just gives you a common abstraction to store things. But in order to store them correctly, you still need a domain model, and you still need to know how to read it correctly. You still need level 2, level 3 on top of that. What we're doing is we're designing level 3 and level whatever.
But what I'm saying, I agree. There's levels, and I agree that you need to be able to design level 2. But I'm saying, if you design level 2 independently of level 1, you get into the discussion we're having, where's the identity of that? And I'm saying, everything has...
We discussed it. The identity is yes or no. Maybe it's the hash, maybe it's not hash, but the identity is the claim and the sentence. It's the combination of these two IDs. If you point to these two things, you're done. And I mean,
and I did ultimately agree with that, but I said that only works if we get everybody to accept IPLD as a principle. And if we have legacy data that doesn't, maybe we want identity that is not necessarily that. But that I'm willing to compromise on. We could make IPLD obligatory.
So can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Okay. What I'm saying is, if somebody uses another identity for something that is not the hash, which is perfectly possible because we'll be interfacing with legacy, with knowledge out there, right? And when we do that, well, basically we'll take the hash and just say, well, this, whatever other identity they use because they didn't know IPLD, we'll just say that is equivalent to this IPLD identity we calculate, and IPLD identity is canonical. We just add an equivalence and we're fine. That I'm perfectly happy with as a solution. Let's make the hashing canonical. Let's bake it into the model, and we can live with that.
I still don't understand what is the purpose of reusing sentences, like making sentences canonical. I don't understand why We can't just have copies as they pop up.
Okay. We could have copies, and then it becomes an indexing problem and a storage problem, which is fine. But at some point, I do, when I say this is for me, there is a domain model concern there in that the many-to-many link has to be traversable in both ways. As long as we can agree on that and have it somewhere in the API or the the code as designed does not allow that without
there's no implementation of any application services right now. There's no use case endpoints. There's only the model, because that's what we're doing. If we want to start talking use cases and endpoints, that's a separate discussion. We can do that as well.
Yeah,
that's probably a useful thing. But I mean, right now, what I would find a good first step is we just have the same model, and then what use case you have, you can implement it on top of that.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is this model. Okay, let's say we agree on IPLD as the hash of the pairs of the link, but that means if we use that, that means that the sentence has an identity, because otherwise we cannot give an identity to the link.
Well,
to answer your question,
if we're doing that, then of course we should implement that hash calculation in the shared libraries. I see no point not to do that if that's the case.
Yes.
But what Tim and I are arguing for is it's still not clear why that thing, the identity, should be anything different than the sentence itself. Because with or without a hash, the sentence itself is also an identity.
Well, so, and maybe this is a step too far, but at some point we're going to be associating claims to one another, right? In some sort of association, which is undefined. And at that point, we're going to need to say, well, I guess that's between claims.
That's between claims. No, at some point we have to standardize. And I agree, there's something a bit arbitrary in, do we consider the sentence as identity or use its hash as identity? We have to standardize on one, because then we'll be calculating hashes of the pair based on that. So we have to make a choice. IPLD
but again, you're saying
if we agree the sentence is the identity, you can do whatever. You can calculate an IPLD hash, you can calculate another hash, you can pick the 5 first characters and hope there's no conflicts in the I mean, yeah, that's a horrible implementation, but I mean.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. No, but the question is, if it's to be a shared identity, we have to all agree on it, right?
The thing we have to agree on is, do we want it to be mutable? Do we want to be able to change something about the declarative sentence without changing its identity? That's what we have to agree on. That's
a perfectly valid point. I agree with that. I'm voting for immutable, obviously.
So then we are agreed. I think the discussion on how you want to point to the story, that it should be separate from this.
The thing is, in terms of, you were asking, is the format legible, right? And I'm come back with an earlier argument. Sorry, I'm repeating myself a lot today. If I make a provenance claim, I will anchor it in the hash of the pair, and that means I won't repeat the whole pair. That's ridiculous. That's wasteful. And that means we need to store the fact that this identity, this hash, is the hash of that pair, because otherwise the JSON will be illegible without redoing all the hash calculations, which is also ridiculous.
But which JSON? Because
what is a provenance claim?
It's saying this pair was introduced by this person on this date. It's linking. We went through that conversation. I feel we're
no, okay, but you said using the word claim. I don't know if you're using our domain definition, glossary definition of claim, or if you're making.
Well, no. Yeah, I am. Sorry, I should have said of the claim sentence pair, which is itself a claim. I'm saying the claim sentence pair is a claim, right? You can agree or disagree that this claim is a proper formalization of that sentence.
I would suggest you try to add to the
Avoid it.
glossary a proposed definition of claim sentence pair.
I'm
That,
fine with
that might be useful, and you did hint at it already now, and I think I understand what it is, and I even think I know how I would model it, and we might disagree on how to model it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's just a claim that has some additional data that points to
No,
another claim.
and I think I agree with that. It is just a claim again. I'm saying that that link is a claim, and as such, it needs an identity.
And it might have a default English formatted declarative sentence associated with it.
Yeah, this I'm not sure, but I'm willing to. This is a real conversation. I'm not going to be stubborn about that one. I'm not sure, but I am stubborn about the fact that it needs an identity.
So we're 1 minute away.
Yeah, I did
must
not
be
show
why
my
then.
JSON model, and that takes longer, and maybe we should do that Friday or now if you're willing to stay on.
I have time, but I would also like to have some action points for next meeting and wrap up some things for this meeting. So for one, Marc-Antoine, I would very much like this conversation to lead to stuff, to glossary requirements, basically. So one thing that I hope can come out of this meeting
Okay.
is that we know what to work on next in terms of glossary.
Okay, fair enough. So I will add cards for, well, you know, it's okay. I will add cards for the links. I will say they need identity and explain that. That's totally on me. I'll add cards for provenance. I'll add cards for a lot of that stuff.
I think provenance probably builds on top of the former. I think if you can somehow, if I were you, I would either go for your claim pair thing or the link, however you want to call it, and try to write that down in terms of using terminology we already have, or argue why that means the current definitions need to change.
I don't think it does. The fact that the claim definition link is a claim in and of itself, I don't think it needs to redefine claim.
Perfect. That would be even better.
It builds on the claim definition, as far as I'm concerned.
Did we have some type of agreement on the other things, that the ID of a claim is a string? Meaning whoever builds an application chooses what to do with that and manages.
Yes.
Yeah.
This.
I
don't know if I agree on that yet.
Okay,
I don't think I heard the full definition, the full discussion around proposals for an ID. And I don't like, if each system makes their own ID format, then it leads to collisions, it leads to all sorts of quality problems. So
okay, I'll have a quick discussion about that. In my view of doing a generic interchange format, it means that you have, this is my ID, and there's a table that goes, this is my ID for this. This is this system, and this is the ID used by this system. So I have systems as entities, and I know, okay, this data is coming from this system, so this is the ID it uses. In topic mapping, I learned recently from Jack that this was called published system identifier. So the idea is that a system publishes certain identities for topics, and as such, this is what you know that, well, this system uses this identity. That doesn't mean that it's the system I'm using. It doesn't mean that another system doesn't use the same identity for something else. But you have to have a three-way table saying my identity, system ID, and ID according to that system.
Yeah, in other words, if you want to integrate with CD, you either use the CD infrastructure IDs, or if you want to integrate two different systems that manage their own identity space, then you'll have to add metadata to these IDs in order to combine them and be able to have the more federated architecture. But I don't think the current domain model needs to say what the ID space is. It's up to the application, up to whoever is using the domain model to decide on the ID space. But one thing I'm going to do in the current code base is add a claim repository, which basically manages the constraints. So for example, if you add a claim and you add a claim of the same ID, it will simply merge them and add the declarative sentences to the same claim. So then it's the repository that manages the ID space.
I gotta go. I have a meeting right now that's already started. So
okay.
See you guys on Friday.
Yeah.
See you.
I'll put it in the glossary, but just one last point. This is why I was vaguely edging towards, oh, maybe the ID should be a string, because if it's a generic URI coming from RDF, it's easy to decompose the RDF into, you know, head and tail, so to speak. But more generally, if we have the notion that the PSI is local to a source, we could say the string should have a constraint of being decomposable into here's the source, here's the ID within that source, and make that generic. And if we're using the canonical identities, then we can have a URI prefix, a URI domain, which is okay because we're in the, I was always thinking of hyper knowledge. So HK, because it's HK colon, we know we're in the HK generic address space, which uses IPLD IDs, and we don't have, that's a decomposition right there from the schema.
Yeah, I mean, it could be useful again.
Somebody else may use UUID, for example, and then use the
It could be useful, again, if that's something we need to be able to deal with within the domain model we share. I mean, I typically also have namespace IDs or whatever, PSIs, whatever you want to call them. But because I anticipate that is a need, I think we're not there yet. I mean, I think the thing we're currently designing is really this thing that should be able to be used in like just a one-off instance on a website where you just preload the data and you fiddle around with the graph and you add stuff and then it gets tossed away. It doesn't even get stored in the database. And just it being a string doesn't exclude what we just talked about either.
Correct. No, exactly. I'm between, do I require the decomposability as a prerequisite or not? That I'm unsure about. I'm tempted to, because of the risk of collision and saying the source should be part of the identifier, but maybe not. And maybe that's a kind of, we know it comes from there, so we know it's this source. This is
the risk of collision is, I mean, if you have one system that expects UUIDs, then I mean, it doesn't even matter the risk of collision, because if you're going to try to upload some data, you'll need to conform to their IDs either way. Today, I mean, the IDs in the end get assigned to whatever infrastructure you're talking to.
Well, the risk of collision between PSIs from different sources is non-null, because a lot of people use strings as PSIs, right? They use language strings, and then the collision is almost unavoidable.
Collisions are solved by the backends, not by the data model, is what I'm trying, not by the domain model, is what I'm trying to say.
And there I tend to agree, and this is why I've been wavering. I'm seeing the pros and cons of saying, is that an ID requirement or not? I think for clarity, I'd like it to be a requirement, but because of what you just said, I'm tempted to say no and just a string. So I'm not hard and fast on this one.
We could have both. We could have a reference implementation, that builds on top of I mean, I see no reason not to do this in parallel as well, and have a reference implementation that actually implements the IDs and hosts them and stores them in a database using whatever safer, collision-safe mechanism you want to use. But
yeah,
I think it should be decoupled.
I'm perfectly willing to consider that. Okay, sorry, this was a contentious one, but I think this is where we're having the real disagreement about the use cases. So that was worth going through.
Yeah, so try adding the glossary items, try linking it to some use cases maybe, although the glossary was intended to be kind of tiny. We'll see. We can talk about it maybe on Friday. Bentley, this was your suggestion to do more data modeling. Was this what you had in mind, or did I totally hijack this and do something you didn't want to do?
Yeah, the intent seems correct. I think Kotlin adds a bit of and even the JSON adds a bit of solidification that I think the pictures don't. So that'd be my preference. But yeah, I think it's good to toggle back and forth.
I will offer JSON. I won't offer code yet, but I'll offer JSON.
Yeah, I'll try to find a way to automatically generate JSON, add it to the repo or something, so you don't need to do what I just did. That would be pretty cool to have in the README. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
See you Friday.
Thank you for today.
And thank you.